Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest of Roxhill Media's lockdown webinars. I'm Michael Davis from Roxhill Media and delighted to be joined by so many of you this morning. I'm not surprised at all because we've got a star guest in person of Ben Wright, the Group Business Editor of the Telegraph. Morning, Ben.
Morning, Michael. How are you?
Very well indeed, thank you. A little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. You'll notice, everybody, we have got a chat room and the questions tab. So during our discussion, in which we hope to cover the impact of the crisis on the media, the business agenda, and how the comm sector should respond to that, please fire in your questions on the right, and we'll try and sew that into discussions. But Ben, if you were given £1 for every time someone said to you that it was extraordinary times, you'd probably have enough for a bailout. But these are extraordinary times, and I was just wondering how you've seen your readers engage with the Telegraph during the crisis.
Yeah, definitely extraordinary times, and in extraordinary times, readers have an insatiable appetite for news. I mean, the way that they're consuming the news is, part of existing trends, but definitely it's sort of influenced by lockdown. So obviously, we're seeing a lot more traffic to the website, a lot more people are reading online, reading more of the sections that are affected by coronavirus. So politics and business comment getting a lot of traffic. Lifestyle, sport, they're still producing great content, but obviously there's less sort of going on in those areas. So they're seeing sort of diminished traffic, but overall the traffic to the Telegraph website is greatly increased, and the sections like politics and comments and business are definitely more than taking up the slack. We're seeing a decline in print circulation, which is to be expected because not so many people go to the news agents. We've had initiatives like free delivery and stuff, but that's not totally filled the gap.
And how are people engaging with the business section? Are you seeing more traffic come to the business side? What sort of stories are catching their imagination?
So a huge amount of traffic to the business site. I was looking at the stats the other day. I mean, there are various different metrics that we have. An important one for us is subscriber page views, because that's the closest we've got to customer satisfaction, if you like. So the existing subscribers to the website, how often they are reading stories on the business section, and the traffic there. I was looking the other day. It's up 400% year on year. So compared to last April, it was up 200% between April last year and the beginning this year. So I like to think that's because we've been improving the product and improving the kind of journalism we're producing and how we are doing it digitally. But then there's a sort of another 200% increase between the beginning of this year and April, and I think a lot of that is around the news agenda and the stuff that we're doing on coronavirus.
No, indeed, but I think that's interesting, worth looking into that a little bit more about the investment that you've been making at the Telegraph, particularly around economics and technology. And actually, those are key themes that you're relying on during the crisis now.
Yes, yeah. I mean, so, happy accident or, if you like, but I mean,
what did you know?
Well, we certainly, I mean, we didn't have a coronavirus correspondent. Actually, we've got a health security editor who has been pretty busy over the last couple of months. But no, I mean, we saw appetite for our readers around economics, macroeconomics, having the world explained to them through that prism. Also, clearly, technology was a key trend, especially in business. The technology businesses themselves, how technology was impacting traditional businesses, and also had the impact of technology firms on society at large. So we'd scaled up both those areas. Economics, we've got a 4-person team, and then obviously regular columnists who write about economics. And with technology, we've got a team of 9, 3 of whom are in San Francisco, and that's just been a godsend coming into this coronavirus crisis, because clearly a lot of what we're looking at is being looked at through the prism of technology and through the prism of economics.
No, indeed, and I think your economics team are going to be very busy way after the crisis itself, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But could you give us a little bit of colour around how the Telegraph's actually responded to the challenge of lockdown, and how your team is now set up, and how I must admit, and don't want to blow too much smoke your direction, but I do think it is phenomenal.
Keep going.
I do think it's the papers, it's not necessarily a nice way to look at these things, but you've had a very good crisis. It's remarkable how well you've been able to put the paper together and get one out every day, and it's almost been seamless from before. But how do you manage in the lockdown?
Well, that's very kind of you. It's, sort of touch wood. It's kind of, obviously the move into lockdown was gradual. We could kind of see it coming, so that allowed us to try out various things. And we, with the team, we had a period where we had half the team in the office and half the team working from home. So it was they were working alternate days. Then we had the desk in the office and all of the journalists. At this point, almost everybody's working from home. Some people have sort of gone back to live with their parents. We have someone in Ireland, we have somebody in Birmingham, and luckily we have the technology. It's existing and it's holding up pretty well, that we can communicate relatively seamlessly. It's probably, I think I was saying to you the other day, sort of everything feels like it's sort of 10 or 15% harder than it would be if we were all in the office and we were able to turn around and just, ask follow-up questions on stories that have been filed, or what somebody means by a particular phrasing, or could you add in this, or could you talk to that person. So it is a little bit trickier, but so far it has kind of worked all right. We've got very structured meetings through the day. They've just become so much more important. And then we are ensuring that all of the journalists, we're talking to everybody on the phone at least once a day. More often than not, it turns out to be sort of 2 or 3 times. So we're just lots and lots of communication and regular contact. The trickier thing for me is the communications with other desks, and just picking up the buzz of a newsroom. You just don't have that if you're sitting in your own room and sort of trying to get it off GChat and Twitter and things. It's just not the same. But and then the communications with the design teams and the picture desk, and coordinating with the news desk. Is this our story or your story, or are we working on it together? Those things are a little bit more stodgy. But overall, I've been surprised at how easy is the right word, but seamless it has been to be able to do it with most people working from home.
Have you changed the sort of daily biorhythms of your working life? What time the conference is happening? How are you fitting in with?
Well, the times are actually the same, but there's definitely been a sort of slight shift in emphasis. So we have our first sort of get together at 8 o'clock, and that's the desk of editors. Somebody from economics, someone from personal finance, somebody from technology, and we're just talking about what the main stories for the day are, what's hit the RNS, how we want to develop it, and also sort of particular themes that we're tackling time and again, how we want to do it today, and that feeds into a meeting at 8:30, which is between all of the desks. Before this crisis, that was mostly thinking digitally, and it was mostly thinking about features and analysis. But increasingly, there is more of an emphasis on news, and setting the news agenda earlier, getting hairs running. Not necessarily what the story might be, but the kind of stories we want to be going after today. And in terms of how you monitor the news flow, that must be a bit trickier from home. Yeah, it is, but you're still monitoring it in the same way. I think the trickier thing is, because basically you've got the news desk and they're sort of the eyes on the news flow, whereas before, if someone spots something, they just say, "Have you seen this?" Now we're sort of G-chatting each other. So as I say, it's slightly more stodgy, but you're still monitoring all the normal news feeds and outlets and the wires and Twitter, and that still works in the same way. It's just sort of making sure that everybody else has seen it.
But the harsh reality is that even though the crisis has heightened the awareness of, well, certainly the demand for news, it's undercut the business models on which the media relies. Do you think there's a case for bailout of the media?
I don't know. I mean, clearly we've been hit hard, and it's. I mean, it's like every industry is. It's what does a recovery look like? Do we come out of this and it sort of bounces back to where it was about February, or is it sort of catalyzed existing trends and they're going to be entrenched after this? Clearly, we've seen a decline, as I mentioned, of print circulation. We've seen a total drop-off in advertising, both print and online, and we've seen a huge uptick in subscriptions. Now, that was always the sort of model that we were skewing towards, but we would probably would have wanted this crisis to happen in, I don't know, 18 months, 2 years' time, when those trends were more entrenched and we had a greater reliance on subscription revenue. For the wider news industry, I mean, I kind of think if it's not this that scuppers certain business models, then it'll be something else. And this is the free marketer in me. I think ultimately you've got to stand on your own 2 feet, and that's true of news as it is of any industry.
I remember you telling me 2 years ago that the business part of the Telegraph was very successful within the overall Telegraph offering at converting people to subscriptions. Is that you're seeing that?
Yeah, I mean, we are. We're definitely seeing a huge number of the subscriptions that the Telegraph is getting are coming through the business channel. I mean, that was always part of the wider strategy for the Telegraph. We were one of the first sections to go fully behind the paywall, as was politics, as was comment, and those sections are also pulling in lots of subscriptions. But yeah, I think the business section is quite central to that strategy of getting people to pay for content.
Anyway, that's enough navel gazing and chatting about the media. Let's turn now to the business agenda. We've never seen such big state intervention with the business sector. How do you see it unwinding?
With difficulty. I mean, you take whatever part of it you care to mention. But I mean, we're looking at the furlough scheme today. Some suggestions that Rishi Sunak wants to reduce the amount of furloughing of money or the proportion of pay that will be part of the furlough scheme from 80% to 60%, wants to avoid a cliff edge. That may be avoiding a cliff edge, but if it's you that's being reduced from 80% to 60%, it's going to feel like a very steep hill. It's going to be incredibly hard to unwind these things. And the economy is so incredibly interconnected that just trying to figure out where to start is incredibly hard. Do you open the schools so that people can go back to work? Do you allow grandparents to see their grandchildren so that they can provide some childcare to the under 9s, so that their parents could go back to work? Where do you even start? It's incredibly hard. But I mean, that's going to be the story of the rest of the year, I think, at least.
No, indeed. And on the basis that the crisis changes everything, how do you think the business agenda is going to evolve? What's going to be the key themes over the next year?
So unwinding state intervention. I think sort of whether this medical crisis turns into a financial crisis, I still think there's a risk of that. And then in terms of business sections, as we've been discussing for the media industry, it's very clear that this crisis has catalyzed a whole load of existing trends. So be it retail and the troubles on the high street, that's just been turbocharged by this. The car industry and the move away from combustion engines. Well, there was, number of cars that were registered in April was down 97%. The best-selling model was the Tesla Model 3, right? So it's all of what we saw before happening, but on steroids and on a massively truncated timeline, I think.
Yeah. So the green debate is going to get certainly the the government could be relying on a green stimulus to help us get out of this. Do you think?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting debate, isn't it? Because there's all sorts of discussion about whether this accelerates or retards the transition. Does the record low oil price mean that oil is stuffed, or is it is the fact that it's super cheap mean that it undercuts some of these renewable technologies? I think that will play out over the coming months, and will be a fascinating one to cover.
Yeah. How do you think the debate about executive pay is going to be reframed by the crisis? I see one of the stories you've got on the site today flags up the Ocado revolt.
Yeah. Well, again, it's sort of existing trends, isn't it? So I mean, the Ocado pay revolt is you can stick that in the diary every year. It becomes, if people are on furlough and they're taking 20% cuts, and we've seen executives obviously foregoing bonuses, well, that's a sort of tacit admission that they need to share in some of the pain and the hard time. Well, that becomes the base level then, doesn't it? And if there's an admission now that executive pay essentially was too high, then or out of step with employees, then that becomes the starting point for all future discussions.
Now, one of the bullet points I jotted down on my list here was banking crisis, and your background is the city. I was interested that you just flagged a possible financial crisis as rearing its head in the not too distant future. How much of a reality do you think that is, and where do you think it might stem?
Well, I think if you're talking banks, then I suppose the narrative so far is that they obviously got it dreadfully wrong in 2008, and the rules that were put in place and the additional capital that the banks have been forced to take on since then have allowed them to weather this crisis. And there's a sort of side debate about whether you've made banks so risk averse that it's now making it harder for them to help out the economy. When they're needed. Mark Carney was talking as the crisis was starting and just before he left about how the banks were the problem last time, but they could be part of the solution this time. I think that's partly true, but it's proved to be stodgier and more difficult to implement, and partly that's because you've got essentially a generation of bankers who are very wary about lending, and now they're being told to get the money out of the door incredibly fast, and that's created issues. And there are also sort of rules about making sure that you're lending responsibly and you're not giving money to people who can't pay it back. Well, right now that's quite a hard assessment to make. But if there's a financial crisis, I suspect it will happen away from the banks. It will happen in the shadow banking or the buy side, whatever you want to call it. At the moment, the markets have rallied massively. Now you've got to take a view on whether that is sort of rational or not. And if it's not, and then there's a second slump, then I think there'll be sort of knock-on effects in the markets and therefore the investors that hold those assets.
There's been quite a lot of focus on leverage going out of fashion, but particularly in the property sector. Do you think that's cause for concern?
Yeah, I'm sure it will be, and I'm sure there will be a period where investors ask executives to row back on leverage, but these things are cyclical. They'll ask them to row back until other companies in the sector start taking on more leverage a couple of years from now, and that starts juicing their returns, and they're asking why the companies they're investing in aren't performing so well, and then we'll get back into that whole debate again. It's somebody once told me that leverage is like sunlight. You're kind of not enough and you're a little bit anemic, too much and you get frazzled. You want to get just the right level, but it's just the right level at the point in the business cycle, and that's always the hard judgment to make.
Yeah. And finally, let's talk a little bit about some of the communications challenge arising from the crisis. Is everything being looked at? Well, of course, everything is being looked at through the prism of coronavirus. But is there room for any non-coronavirus stories at the moment?
Not much, but it's shifting a bit. I mean, the first 4 or 5 weeks of this, no, none. A moment that sticks in my mind is when Rishi Sunak was standing up and talking about all of the different bailout plans he had. He was talking about furloughing and all the business well, it wasn't business bounce back loans. It was what are now the CBILS, sort of coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. And in the middle of that speech, HSBC put out its new chief executive. I think we ended up nibbing that. What is HSBC? The 4th, 5th biggest company in the UK, and we nibbed its new chief executive. I mean, he had been the acting chief executive, so it was only a rubber stamping. But that would have been a splash on a normal day. So yeah, I mean, coronavirus has crowded everything out. I mean, we are thinking in terms of there only being one story in town. We were talking about the economics team, the business team, the personal finance team. Essentially, they're all the coronavirus team at the moment. But it has calmed down a bit. The first 3 or 4 weeks, I think I was saying to you, we could have produced the section of the paper 3 or 4 times over. In fact, we effectively were. We sort of had a plan in place for 11 o'clock, which was totally superseded by 2 o'clock, which was totally superseded by 5 o'clock, and by the time it went to press, it was effectively another edition. And that has calmed down a bit. We've got back to the point where by 11 o'clock, the vast majority of the stories that are on the news list are the ones that are going to make it into print. So that's allowed us a bit more breathing space. But it's definitely still being seen through the prism of this crisis now. Occasionally there are big enough stories that they do break through, but they have to be pretty big. No.
So what catches your eye? Is it purely just the size or the scale of the implication? How do people flag things up, make things relevant at the moment?
It's the same as it always was, but it's just sort of ever more so. So I mean, the company is particularly interesting to our readers. So it's sort of consumer facing, supermarkets, or it's personality driven. So this is coronavirus related, but there's obviously been a lot about Virgin Atlantic. Readers can't get enough of that company. A, because they know it. B, because they know Richard Branson, and C, because they have strong feelings about him, I think. So that's always true. Companies that are relevant to our readers, big personalities, and trends that are either help to explain what's going on in the world or have implications for them. So lots on house prices, as always. Sort of Telegraph staple.
Yeah.
The market is essentially shut, so we're trying to think of creative ways of covering that. All of the existing things.
Yeah, SMEs is often we've got a question here. As SMEs make up such a large proportion of the UK economy, will there be a focus on whichever of the businesses will boom post-quarantine as people pursue those quarantine dreams, potentially lift our economy?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things about this crisis is the amount of SME coverage has been massively increased by us, because we're wanting sort of stories from the front line, and all companies are being sideswiped by this thing, but the smaller the company, the harder it is to weather. So stories about how companies are completely re-engineering their business, doing totally different things to what they did before, and then sector by sector, how they're sort of going to come out of lockdown. We obviously want to hear about the big companies. We want to hear about the small ones. And then the sort of bounce back loans and the CBILS, those are all focused at the SME end of the market. And the government is acutely conscious that that's the backbone of the economy, and that's a key part of keeping things going. And therefore, it's a sort of key part of our coverage.
Do you think there's, well, certainly from the buy side, your side of the equation, do you think there's more demand for sort of positive, uplifting stories at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is. It was sort of pretty relentlessly negative for a while, and you do need a mix in your coverage. I mean, it's a mix of news, analysis, comment. You also need a light and shade, and certainly we have a slot at the moment that we've been running for, I can't remember. Time becomes meaningless, doesn't it? 3 or 4 weeks at least are called Open for Business, with different businesses that are, figuring out ways to keep operating throughout the lockdown. And we've been producing lots of case studies of businesses and how they're dealing with things. And I mean, so you kind of saw that with LVMH when they turned very quickly to producing hand sanitizer. That story took off. That was very early in the crisis, and that kind of story really sort of captured the imagination. There was a little bit of bandwagon jumping after that, and everybody was producing hand sanitizer and sending it to the NHS. So that's sort of the interest in that kind of trailed off pretty quickly. As you had 100 companies doing it, but which from a PR perspective is incredibly difficult. How do you do something new? How do you do something that cuts through? And how do you do it in a way that doesn't seem gauche? How do you help people without shouting about the fact that you're helping people and sort of undercut the good work?
Yeah, no, the tone of communications is very hard in this crisis, particularly as people like me see it as a bad news story that they're not making whiskey anymore. But we've got a couple of questions here, one from Charlotte and one from Nicolinas about op-ed and who is the best person to get in touch with regarding business-related opinion pieces, and how do you think? Where are we? Yes. Sorry, no, it's from Matthew. Are you looking for commentary on the legal angles of COVID, and how will it affect businesses? And if so, what's the best way to pitch our experts? So one there about op-ed, and another one just about people giving their opinions.
So yeah, I mean, op-eds. I'm the point person. Possibly sort of regret saying that, but I put together our comments on a daily basis. I would say that I'm absolutely up to my eyeballs in comment suggestions. So people do send ideas, and I'm afraid sometimes I do ignore them. If they're well pitched, they do cut through though. So we do run things. We have a lot of our own columnists, so there's not a lot of space on a daily basis in the paper. But if it's a particularly unique take, a unique idea, angle, and all from a really sort of big respected name, then we are open to them. But they do struggle to get heard, I have to admit.
Now, one here from Clinton is asking about the unwinding of the government intervention. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to look a little bit more about your economics team. Yep. If you could give us a little bit of background on the investment you've made there and the plans moving forward for the economics team. So I think it's going to be a big part of your Telegraph coverage, certainly for the next year.
Yeah, well, I would say it always has been. So it's sort of it's building on sort of an existing strength, and at these events, I've always said in the past when we're looking at page views, and that was our main metric. It tended to be the economics coverage, the sort of macroeconomic analysis, Ambrose's columns, Jeremy Warner's columns that did well, and that we didn't really have clickbait on the business section at the Telegraph, but that was our clickbait. That did really well for page views, and lo and behold, it does really well for subscriber page views and registrations and subscriptions. So every sort of metric that you look at, that is a really important area for us. And it being important, and at least up until this crisis, the Telegraph investing in the newsroom, that was a prime area. So we've always had two or three in my time there, correspondents. That's now up to 4, and we appointed an economics editor. That was Russ Lynch, who came from the Evening Standard, who's fantastic. And that's he's a very senior journalist, and he manages that team and their output, and it allows us to be a bit more structured, plan the kind of things that we're doing, whilst also being sort of nimble and being able to react to daily breaking news.
An interesting question here from Melissa, as we're all thinking about how our lives are going to, well, hopefully get back to a more normal approach. She says, what are the implications of this new normal on the editorial setup of the business desk in the near future? What do you think in 6 months from now, when things are calmer, would this enhance Telegraph's digital first approach?
Oh yeah, I think so, definitely. I mean, we've always been quite digital first. I mean, we just celebrated, I can't remember, was it our 25th anniversary of having a website, because we were the first newspaper in the UK to launch a website. I joined, it's nearly 6 years ago, and the main thing I was asked to do is put more oomph into our digital publishing side. The paper is still and will continue to be incredibly important, but we can see where news is going. All we don't know is how long it will take to get there. We need to be doing both of those products. I think we have hopefully strengthened both, and it is possible to do both at the same time, and it is possible to do it with a 7-day operation. When I first took over, we had too few journalists to do it. We have now added to our resource, both in terms of numbers, but also in the seniority of our journalists. And I think there is no substitute for having good journalists. But we're also sort of getting savvier about how we publish online, what we do with headlines, timings, all 1,000 different ingredients that go into a successful digital strategy. And it continues to iterate. I mean, there isn't a week or a month that goes by that we don't come up with a new initiative and try and get better in how we publish digitally. And there's no end point to that. We just keep going.
And the new subscribers and the new traffic that you're getting to the site, are you able to do any analysis on the sort of people that they are? Is your readership profile at the Telegraph changing?
If we have, I haven't seen it. We're probably too busy at the moment to sort of go that granular. At the moment it's sort of raw numbers. So a subscriber is a subscriber. I mean, we know traditionally who our readers are, so we sort of continue to think of them in the same way. It skews slightly younger online, obviously, and as time goes by, it gets younger as well. And we're doing lots on various different channels, Snapchat and YouTube and videos and all sorts, and that alters things over time.
Just a last couple of questions before we finish up. There's been a follow-up on some of the on your comments about the comment pieces. Is it the quality of the comment or the person who's making the comment that's important to you?
A mix of both. So if Jeff Bezos wants to write a comment, he can send us his shopping list, and I will publish it. If it's not Jeff Bezos, then as punchy as possible and as interesting. And there are lots of people pitching similar type comments who of sort of mid-level executives, and it's just going to struggle to stand out from the crowd. I mean, it's like a news story. Is it? How interesting is this? How well known is this person?
And there's been a few questions about the travel sector and how you think that can see a path to recovery, and whether business travel is going to be an important part of that.
I'm sure it will recover, but it will take a long time, won't it? I mean, the airline industry itself is saying that it's going to take 2 years to get back to where we were at the beginning of this year, at least. I've long thought that we've been living in a golden age of travel. It always struck me as extraordinary that I could get a flight to the south of Spain for less than I could get a taxi to the south of London. I mean, just intuitively, that seems nuts, right? And that was about overcapacity. That said, airlines go bust, but if they do, the planes are still there, the slots are still there, the trained pilots are still there, and it's a bit like newspaper industry. There's always a nutter who wants to own a airline. So I do think people will come in and they will take hold of these assets, even if they have been even if there are companies that go bust, they will recover, but it'll take a while.
Now, it's tricky experimenting with new things at the best of times, but during the crisis is quite hard. But have you thought that there are other ways to deliver your news, experiment with other formats, etc.?
Not really. I mean, I think online is obviously key for us. There was a long time when we were discussing about the internet and mobile as if they were two distinct things. There's less of that discussion now. I think we've sort of got our head around that, so I don't think there will be anything radical. I don't think we'll be. I don't know. I can't think of what would replace online at the moment.
But are you happy with the mix of video and podcasts and things that you've got as within the mix?
Yeah, I mean, we do bits and pieces on video. We could always do more. It's trying to figure out what the right subjects to tackle them and how to tackle it. And we are a print online publisher, and and I think business is particularly difficult because it's often not as visual as other sections. But it's something we're always thinking about, and we're always trying to do more, because when videos work, they tend to work really well. And podcasts is something we've thought about. I mean, we've other sections have got very successful podcasts. Politics has got Chopper's podcast, which has done really, really well, and sport as well. But we're pretty busy at the moment, so we'll just sort of focus on what we've got.
Great. Now I'm going to give the last question to Adam Taylor, who actually managed to ask the first question as well. Have PR approaches changed significantly in the past few months? If so, what changes?
Have what? Sorry?
PR approaches changed significantly in the past few months? If so, how?
No, I don't think so. I think it's more of the same. I mean, every email starts with "I hope you are well" and managing in these unprecedented times. I think we need to get to a point where we just sort of drop that. But on the whole, I mean, people are still approaching us in the same way, and it is the success is scattergun. It is what catches our interest, piques our interest at any given point, and the vast majority of the time, this is probably not what people want to hear, but it's sort of serendipity. We're thinking about something, and then something lands in our inbox that matches that. Boom, away we go. We need a comment on this, and lo and behold, somebody pitches it. So that kind of requires you to adopt the blunderbuss approach and try and ensure that you increase your chances of getting a hit.
Excellent. Ben, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Cool.
And well done for doing such a great job. I think the media has pulled out a blinder and has kept us all well informed. I think the balance between sort of proper authoritative news and fake news has worked well in our favour, and I look forward to catching up in better times and a not too distant future. But thank you all for joining us this morning. The great thing about actually experimenting with some of these online sessions, we can fit far more of you in here than we can in City Auditoria, and we don't have a huge pile of uneaten croissant at the end of it. But Ben, thank you very much for joining us this morning, and presumably you're off to go interview a FTSE chief executive via Zoom in a moment.
No, I think I'm just going to be checking in on the news list and see where we got to.
Excellent. Good stuff.
Cheers.
Thank you,
Michael.